welcome back after the summer to our Colloquium series, which we're very, very excited to start off here with Dave Blei. So as you know, you've seen like talks here where it goes either from machine learning into important biomedical applications, or the other way around, from applications to actually developing foundations of machine learning. And today we're definitely going to be more on that route. And I know Dave will also tell us how this can also be applied and give pointers to different things that are also ongoing or that have motivated the type of work that he's going to talk about. So I'm sure we all know Dave Blei. So he's a professor in statistics and computer science at Columbia University, got his PhD in Berkeley, and then was at Princeton for some years before moving to Columbia. Has had a lot of different awards, particularly a lot of test of time awards, which I find always like very impressive at NeurIPS, at ICML, KDD, and Simon's Investigator, Fellow of the IMS, et cetera, et cetera. So his research is mainly in the field of Bayesian statistics and machine learning, and really thinking very heavily about starting from many different types of applications and then going to really principled methods. I'm sure you're all familiar with a lot of work in topic modeling, and then now more and more also in causality, and that's what you're going to talk about today on hierarchical causal models. So I'm very, very excited to see that. So thank you, Dave, for being here, and very excited about your talk.
Thanks. Thanks, Caroline. Thanks so much for inviting me. Yeah, I'm Dave Blei. I'm going to talk about hierarchical causal models, and thanks for such a nice introduction. I remember I did win a Test of Time award for work I did when I was a postdoc, and I called my postdoc advisor, John Lafferty. I said, good news, we won this Test of Time award for our paper. And he said, you know what that means, Dave? It means you're old. Anyway, and he was right, and that was a lot of years ago. So I want to talk about hierarchical causal models. And I'll mention biology. I know you are all focused on biology. But the tutorial example is going to be more in the social sciences, but hopefully it will still help you understand the idea, and you'll see the connections to the kind of questions that you want to answer. So let's just start with a question. Suppose you are a superintendent of schools, and there's a bunch of schools in your district, and you want to know how tutoring affects test performance. Okay, so people in the different schools, they get different numbers of hours of tutoring, and then they all take a standardized test. And here are some different schools in your district, and you want to know how tutoring affects test performance in this world. Your data, you're the superintendent, so you get all the data you want. Your data is the average tutoring hours and test performance from many schools. Okay, so each of these schools, you get the average number of tutoring hours at the Springfield Elementary School, average number of tutoring hours here at, I guess this is my wife's high school, average number of tutoring hours at my high school and at the Buffy High School. And then you get the average test performance of the students at all these schools. Now here you're going to draw a causal graphical model because you're a pretty sophisticated superintendent. And so here's the model you would draw, where you have average tutoring hours, average test performance, and you want to estimate the expectation of average test performance in a world where I intervene on tutoring hours and set it equal to h, right? That's when you mathematically ask, what do we mean by a causal inference? We're asking a question about an intervention. So there's your intervention. I'm going to give everybody 10 tutoring hours, h is 10. What's going to happen to test performance? What's the expected average test score if I set the average tutoring hours to h? Now the problem is there's an unmeasured confounder in your graph. Okay, so for example, the school's budget, some schools are well-funded, some are not, affects both how many tutoring hours you deliver, but also is going to affect the general quality of the school, and so affect the test scores as well. Okay? And you don't have the school's budget in your data. I mean, you would if you were the real superintendent, but let's say you don't, and there might be other confounders too. And so if you know about causal graphs, you can see from this graph that the causal estimand, the expectation of average tutoring hours in a world where I intervene, expectation of test performance in a world where I intervene on tutoring hours is not identifiable. You can't, even if you had an infinite number of schools, you'd never be able to figure it out. Okay, but what if we observed the students themselves within the schools? Okay, so we observe not just the average number of tutoring hours and test performance, but we get to know each of the individual people's number of tutoring hours and test scores for all the different schools, okay? Then it turns out we can estimate the causal effect of tutoring hours. Okay? This is well-known stuff, but we're going to generalize it. And so let me just show you how. So here is now a new causal model. This is the subject of today's talk. This is a hierarchical causal model. It's a causal model with an inner plate. Inner plate, this box means replication of variables inside the main unit of analysis. And in this case, it's students nested inside schools. Okay, so here I have my confounder, but now instead of average tutoring hours, I have Aij, the number of tutoring hours that student J in school I received, and Yij, which is the test performance of student J in school I. And I still want to measure the expectation of test performance in a world where I intervene on tutoring hours, but now I'm going to show you how you can estimate that causal, you can identify that causal estimand, even though there's still an unobserved confounder. And what's important here is that the unobserved confounder is at the school level budget. Okay, so this unobserved confounder is the same value for all the students in each school. Okay, but just this kind of graph is what we're going to be talking about today. All right, so let me first just show you how you can identify it. So first, we'll write the intervention, expectation of Y in a world where I intervene on tutoring hours, as a conditional given the unobserved U. Okay, so this is just backdoor adjustment where I condition on the unobserved confounder, expectation of Y given A equals H and U equals U, P of U du. This is backdoor adjustment to get at this estimand. And don't worry about the fact that we don't observe it yet. And now I'm going to approximate that integral with Monte Carlo. So I take an average over schools of the expectation of test performance given H tutoring hours and U equal to UI, the budget of that school. And here's where we can do what we couldn't do before. Even though we don't observe UI itself, we don't know the budget of each school, we can estimate this conditional expectation without explicitly observing it, okay? And all we need to do that is take the data sets from each school. So here's the, let me see, where is that? Here's the data set for school I. It's for each student how much they were tutored and what their test performance was. We take that data, we fit some kind of model of expectation of Y given tutoring hours, and notice that when I take the data set from Springfield Elementary and I take all those students and I estimate that regression function, let's say it's a regression, then essentially in that regression function, U equals UI for whatever the budget is for Springfield Elementary, even though I never really observed it, right? It's always going to be equal to that for all those students. And so I've effectively estimated this conditional expectation from each of the school's data sets, okay? And since I've gotten that, right, U hat I is a regression fit to school I, and I have a regression fit to each of the schools. I then just substitute that in for my expectation of Y given A equals H and U equals UI in my formula here, right? Here are my fitted regressions for each school. I take the average of those fitted regressions evaluated at H tutoring hours, and presto, I've estimated this expectation, even though I didn't get to observe those budgets. Okay, is that all clear? Good. So here we just ran it as a simulation, just for no other reason than to make this slide. And so you can see that it's accurately estimating the treatment effect, even though it doesn't observe the budgets. Okay, whereas if I just ran a naive regression of the schools of the tutoring hours on test performance in the simulated setting, I'd be biased because of those budgets. Okay, so what happened? First of all, I want to emphasize again, what I just showed you has been well known for a long time, but it was just a point of curiosity for us that somehow in this flat model, we could not estimate this interventional expectation. It wasn't, sorry, we couldn't identify the interventional expectation. But in this hierarchical model, when I expand these aggregated variables into the per student values, I can identify it. And so what I want to talk about today is what does it mean to take a causal model and add hierarchy, if I have data sets like that? And how can it help me with causal inference? Okay. And so just to speak for a brief moment at a high level, the idea is that this kind of causal structure, this kind of hierarchical structure might appear in a lot of different applied settings. In the social sciences, we see citizens within states, and we might have citizen-level variables about political preferences and things like that, and state-level variables about things like budgets and laws that might be confounding our inferences about how some variables affect others. In biology, which you're interested in here, many of you, we have cells within patients, right? Cell-level variables might include genetics and drug efficacy, and patient-level variables might include things like disease status or demographics, and these also might confound our understanding of, for example, a drug on the patient. In physics and chemistry, in many different settings, we have this idea of data nested into groups and maybe even nested further below that. Okay? Speaking just from the methodology perspective, in Bayesian statistics and applied Bayesian statistics, we have long enjoyed the benefits of hierarchical modeling. Okay? Most applied Bayesian statistics papers nowadays are about some kind of hierarchical model where there's multiple groups of data, and the benefits of hierarchical Bayes and of empirical Bayes are all about that idea that when I have multiple groups of data and I estimate something about them simultaneously, I get a benefit. And so what we were trying to do in this work is to understand, but causal graphical modeling has really only considered flat models. It's never really contemplated this idea of nested variables inside units. And so we were asking the question, can we enjoy some of the same benefits that Bayesian statistics enjoys, but via multi-group data in the context of causal modeling? And that's what this work is about. Okay, I will say one thing about biology. So I can't talk about it today, but if you want to invite me again, I'll talk about it then, as long as you saw this talk first. But the applied project that we're working on using these ideas is about understanding the effect of T cells on immune response. Okay, and the idea is, which I learned from my excellent co-author here, Eli Weinstein, each of us has a distribution of T cells in our bodies, and it's called the repertoire. And the question we want to ask is, if I injected some other types of T cells into my body, how well would I protect against some new disease? Okay? And what is the causal effect of the repertoire of T cells? I feel nervous speaking in this crowd about this. What is the causal effect of the repertoire of T cells on my disease outcome? Okay? And again, I'm going to today talk about the kind of mathematical basics of the tools we use to solve this problem, but this is the kind of application that we have in mind and that we're working on now. Okay. Again, this idea of causal inference from group data is an old idea. It appears in lots of different settings, and today what I want to talk about is a graphical methodology for causal reasoning about group data. How can we think about it graphically, and what kind of identification and estimation falls out of that way of thinking? Okay. So now we'll get into the details. To talk about this idea of hierarchical causal models, I'm going to have three motifs, three small little graphs that we're going to be studying. One we call confounder. This is the one we just studied, where I have A. A is always going to be like a treatment. Y is going to be an outcome. I have a treatment to an outcome, but then there's this, what we call a unit level confounder, U, like budget. We're going to have this one called interference and confounder, where A goes to this unit level variable Z. The whole collection of A's goes to Z, and Z also affects the outcome. That's a certain type of interference, not a general interference, but a certain type. And then we're going to have what we call an instrument graph, where there is now this Z variable, which is an instrument, again, nested inside of the units, many Z's. Z goes to A, it's not affected by the confounder, and A goes to a unit level outcome. Okay, we'll talk about these throughout the talk. In each of them, we're going to consider the effects of a soft intervention. So Just to remind you, when you intervene on a variable in a causal graph, what does that mean? You clobber the arrows going into that variable and replace them with whatever it is as determining that variable in your intervention, okay? And so we're going to intervene on A in all of these, and kind of almost necessarily, we're going to consider a soft intervention where we are going to replace the distribution of A with another distribution called Q star A, okay? Now that could be a hard intervention. It could be that we say everybody gets 2 hours of tutoring, or it could be that there is a distribution of tutoring hours that we're imposing on everybody equally at random everywhere, okay? That's called the soft intervention, P of Y. In notation, do A comes from Q star A, all right? And you can see in all these graphs, I removed the arrow from U to A and replaced it with Q star A. What we're going to think about is we observe here passively, but our goal, our inference goal, our estimation goal is to understand what would happen if we did this, okay, in the future. Right, so there's kind of counterfactual inference, which is asking what would have happened had I done that, given that that didn't happen. But that takes so long to say that we could never give a talk about it. And so we're going to rather ask, if I took my data from the schools, but then I made a change and I gave everybody 2 hours of tutoring, what would happen then? Yep. Good. But not that we are going to do this. Yep. We're hypothetically imagining it. And then it's a philosophical question that we won't get into, whether or not you can only consider interventions that you can really do. But certainly people will argue about that, as well as every other aspect of causal inference. Okay. So let's first talk about this confounder graph. So remember, schools are units, so the N plate are units. Students are subunits, that's the M plate. And the variables, Aij, tutoring hours for student J in school I, Yij, test performance for student J in school I, and Ui, for example, budget for school I, a unit level confounder. And the intervention, how does the distribution of tutoring hours affect test performance? This is the example we've been going through. Now, in the second graph, interference and confounder, the variable Z is a unit level descendant, okay? Or we call it interference. And so, for example, you might imagine that there's a school here, and here are all the students in the school, and some of them get tutoring and some of them don't. But then when they go out for recess, as students do, they all discuss what they learned during the day. And so the students that got tutoring are going to tell the students that didn't get tutoring all the cool stuff they learned about math and things, and then that's going to affect everybody's performance on the test. Okay, so that's called interference, where the treatment on one student is going to influence another student even who didn't get treated. Okay, and that's called interference. Okay, and finally in the instrument graph, the outcome variable Y, notice, is now at the unit level. Okay, so this is something about a school. So for example, whether or not school I is listed in a published list of top schools. And there's a new subunit variable, Zij, which randomizes the cause, the treatment, Aij, for subunit J and unit I. What that means is that Zij is some kind of random influence on the treatment variable, Aij, and notice it's unconnected from Ui. So for example, if each school randomly distributes coupons for tutoring to make tutoring 50% off, and does so with different distributions in each school, that would be an instrument. That would be a Zi. Now, you might think, oh, instrumental variables is solved, but not in this situation. And you'll see that we'll do it with different kinds of assumptions than normally used with instrumental variables. Okay, so with those three motifs, I'd like to get into the nitty-gritty details of these hierarchical causal models. And so the roadmap for the talk is to, if you're familiar with causal graphical models, there are these different levels of causal graphical models. And so first what we're going to do is discuss what a hierarchical structural equation model is, what a hierarchical causal graphical model is, and then discuss how to perform identification in a hierarchical causal graphical model, how to do estimation, and then I'll just show you a kind of a toy example with a real data set. Okay, so we'll begin with hierarchical structural equation models and hierarchical causal graphical models. And really, we're just following along the path, the intellectual path of Pearl with hierarchical models, with hierarchical causal graphical models rather than flat ones. Okay, so just to give you a quick review, what is a structural equation model? So a structural equation model, it's before Perl, but this is Perl's formulation of this idea. Each node is a deterministic function of its parents and some independent noise. Okay, so this is a flat model. We have x, a, and y, and it's a square, which means it's a deterministic function. It's a deterministic function of its parents, so a is a deterministic function of x and some independent noise variable gamma. Okay, and you can write down a schedule of equations to describe a structural equation model. So here, gamma x, gamma a, and gamma y come from some distribution. They're going to be independent. I guess I didn't make that clear in this notation. And then now you see the variables are deterministic functions. X is a deterministic function of its noise. A is a deterministic function of x and its noise. And y is a deterministic function of a and x and its noise. Okay, and these are all just functions. Okay, the idea behind structural equation models when you're building out your causal graph is that you require a deterministic function node, an endogenous node, for any variable that affects two or more others. Otherwise, it can be thought of as a noise variable. Now, again, following Perl's, this is just Perl. Again, Perl now takes these structural equation models and uses them to define what he calls a causal graphical model. And the idea there is to integrate out the noise, so integrate out the random noise to produce random variables instead of deterministic variables. Okay? And this looks familiar to you. This is just a probabilistic graphical model. It inherits all the properties of a probabilistic graphical model. Here I have x going to a going to y coming from a and x. It defines a joint distribution of x, a, and y that factorizes using these factors. But because it came from the causal model, the structural equation model, it can tell us something about the world of interventions. That's the idea. And there's nothing magical here. We're assuming it came from this the structural equation model, and that's what's giving us that power to be able to predict something about an intervention in the world through this causal graph. Okay, but this, just when you see it in papers, is a causal graphical model. Looks just like a graphical model. If you saw it in the street, you would think it's a graphical model. But if you have the secret knowledge that it came from a structural equation model, you know that you can make predictions about interventions with this. That's the idea. So now we have our question. How do we take our situation where I have replications inside of a plate and think about a structural equation model in that context? And here there's an important detail. Unlike classical structural equation models, for every subunit level variable, we're going to include 2 levels of noise. Okay, so here's the model you write down on your whiteboard when you're thinking about how the thing works that you're trying to figure out. And this is the corresponding structural equation model. And what's different about this from a typical one is that this variable here, aij, it doesn't just have one noise variable going into it, but it has 2. It's got a subunit level noise variable, epsilon ij, and a unit level noise variable, gamma I. Okay? And the idea behind this is that the subunit level noise, epsilon here, captures variation within the subunit variables, right? In Springfield Elementary, different students get different amounts of tutoring, and that's captured by the randomness in epsilon within Springfield Elementary. Okay? But the unit level noise captures variation among collections of subunit variables. Springfield Elementary and Sunnydale High School have different distributions of tutoring hours. And that difference in those distributions is captured by gamma. Does this make sense? Okay? And so to go from the thing you wrote on your whiteboard because you had subunits, et cetera, to a structural equation model because you want to reason about it causally, you need to think about these 2 levels of noise for the subunit variables. That's one of the nuances. Okay? And then the schedule of equations looks similar. right? I have my noise variables, I have my subunit noise variables, and everybody is a deterministic function of its noise and its parents. Question?
I suppose one perspective on this could be that you unroll this hierarchical model, flatten it in some sense, and would that be equivalent to this, except where those errors are now decomposed into these two different kinds of noises, or is there a difference I'm missing?
Well, I'd have to think harder about the answer to that question to answer it well, but I suspect, my instinct is the answer is no. It's not the same as just unrolling it. If you unrolled it, you would not necessarily say, oh, I might put this gamma here. The key thing is if you unrolled this, you would, and then read Pearl's excellent book, the primer, the Causal Inference and Statistics primer. If you just did that, then you would only put these epsilons in. You would miss this gamma. But the gamma is important because that's not respecting differences between schools. Yeah.
I was just going to maybe say, I think if you made a latent variable for gamma and unrolled it, then maybe it would be equivalent.
Yeah, you could do that. Our point in making this kind of part of the translation process from this picture to the hierarchical structural equation model, which is too many syllables, is that this is a picture you might draw when you're just thinking about how do variables relate to each other. You wouldn't necessarily put a latent variable there, but it's implicitly there. And actually, I'll give an example for what this might mean kind of intuitively in a second. Question?
Are you assuming that the different noises are independent?
Yes, they are independent. Yep. Okay. There's the schedule, and so you can see it looks real similar to before, but now I have two sources of noise. But notice that Yij, for all the students in Springfield Elementary, just make sure, I know I'm old as I mentioned, so that's the Simpsons school. Okay, that's what we had there before. For all the students in Springfield Elementary, they all share the same value of gamma. Iy, right? So gamma gets chosen once, and then all the students in Springfield Elementary share that gamma in their structural equation, but each one has a different epsilon, right? Some students do better than others. And in Sunnydale, that's the Buffy one, all the students share the same gamma again. It might be a different gamma because it's drawn once for that one, but each one has a different epsilon. Okay? So now to the interpretation. The noise variables represent hidden causes that are not confounding. Okay, this is the idea behind these noise variables. They reflect variation that's not confounding in the variables that you're modeling. And the intuition is that the subunit noise just represents that there is non-confounding variation among students inside a school. The unit level noise on subunits reflects hidden causes at the unit level, right? So for example, there might be a good teacher at Springfield Elementary, right? That's gamma. Everybody benefits from that good teacher. Oh, this is the y variable. So there's the good teacher. Everybody benefits from that good teacher in the same way. And it's not that that good teacher is at a student level. And whereas a student in another school does not benefit from that same good teacher. Okay, that's the idea. Okay, so we've got the hierarchical structural equation model. That's really the basic material of this idea. Now, well, let's play the same game that Pearl plays to create causal graphical models, and we'll integrate out all this noise. Okay, so first we're going to integrate out the subunit level noise, and you can see we have a little graphical model for the subunit here, right? We just did the same thing that you do classically. But now we're going to integrate out the unit level noise, all right? And now something interesting is going to happen, speaking of latent variables. So what just happened? When we integrated out the unit level noise, we produced these new variables called Q, which in the superscript shows you what, so I don't know how to explain this. Let me just think about it. We can think of this subunit as being a little graphical model, right? P of A, P of Y given A for school I, all right? And when we integrate out the unit level noise, what we're doing is we are producing new random variables that are the factors in this graphical model, right? This is P of A Qi of A for school I. This is P of Y given A for school I. Okay? That's what we're doing when we integrate out the unit level noise. The unit level noise is affecting the distribution of the subunit variables. And so when we integrate out the unit level noise, we have to make nodes for that distribution. And those are random distributions because every time I make a new school, I first choose Q of A, then I choose Q of Y given A, and then I let the students get tutored and stuff. Okay? Notice, that's one thing to notice. So these Q variables are important. And also notice how connectivity changed. So we had this unit level variable xi. When we integrated out gamma I, it became a random variable. But it was connected to school performance. However, because it's a unit level variable, its only relationship to test performance, sorry, I said school performance, I meant test performance. Its only relationship to test performance is through the distribution of test performance for that school. And so the connectivity, X goes to Q and Q goes to Y. These subunit variables are only ever going to be connected to factors in the subunit. Make sense? Okay. And I'll show you the algorithm for how to connect this up later. All right, and so now we have our hierarchical causal graphical model, where we have these new variables Q, which are distributions drawn from distributions of distributions. Okay, this is a distribution over distributions of A. This is a distribution over conditional distributions of Y given A. Okay, put differently, they lie between the unit level variables and the subunit variables, and again, oh, that's another thing to notice. They do not inherit the connectivity of the subunit variables. That's also important. So whereas A is connected to Y, excuse me, QIA is not connected to QIY given A. Okay. And in the paper, you can see a derivation for why this all happens. All right, so here is the graphical algorithm for turning a hierarchical structural equation model into a hierarchical causal graphical model. For each subunit variable, form subunit level random variables and remove the subunit level noise. That's easy. That's just the same classical thing, just applied to the subunit. For the regular unit level variables like X, form unit level random variables and remove unit level noise. That just gave us the X as a random variable there. And then for each subunit level variable, form unit level variables for the factor, V given its parents. That's where we make these Q variables. Disconnect the unit level variables from the subunit variables, and then connect the unit level parents of Vij to these Qs. All right, so this is now a thing you can follow to turn your hierarchical SEM to a hierarchical CGM. Okay, so I'm not going to go through it in that much detail, but I'll just show you. So here's the thing you draw on your board because that's the problem you're solving. And now there is your hierarchical SEM corresponding to that graph. And now here is the corresponding hierarchical causal graphical model. Again, you can see that whereas there's an arrow here, there's no arrow here. That's going to be important for identification. Here's the interference graph. Here is the corresponding hierarchical causal graphical model, where you can see some interesting stuff happened with Z and the Qs. Okay? Here's the instrument graph, and here's the hierarchical causal graphical model. You can see we have a Q for Z that's disconnected from everything else, Q of A given Z here, and some interesting things happening with how it's connected. Okay, so that's the work you do when you draw your assumptions like this with a subunit and to go to something like this, which I'm calling a hierarchical causal graphical model. The next thing we're going to do is try to figure out how to identify causal effects in the context of these causal graphical models. And you'll see it's going to be not that tricky. There are assumptions about the way that Y depends on this collection of A's. And in particular, it needs to sort of exchangeably depend on it. It can't be that Y depends on the first student and the third student and the ninth student. It has to be that if I saw these A's in different order, I would have the same distribution of Y. That's crucial. All right, so now let's do identification and estimation. Just to remind you, if I'm sitting with a causal inference problem, I've set up a graph, that's my world, and the first question I have is, can I identify the causal estimand? So I've set up my graph, I write down the effect of the intervention as some kind of expectation, like expectation of y due QA. And then I ask if I can identify it, meaning if I had actual access to the joint distribution that my causal graphical model represents, if I had access to that joint distribution, or equivalently I had infinite data from that joint distribution, could I then figure out what this causal estimand is? And the premise is that if you can't, which sometimes you can't, then there's no hope in trying to estimate it from finite data. You're sunk. If you can, then often that formula for how to identify the causal effect leads you to an algorithm for estimating it from finite data by estimating the various components of that formula. So putting the causal estimand in terms of the observational joint distribution is what identification is about. Okay? So I just said this. We're writing an interventional distribution in terms of the observational distribution. So for example, using the due calculus, Pearl's due calculus, is one way to get at identification. And again, I said this earlier, we're going to consider a soft intervention on A, where we intervene on A with this Q star. But now in our new model that has these Q factors in them, that's just replacing this this Q factor with Q star A. Okay, so there's my intervention. This is my observational distribution. This is my intervened distribution. And so what we're going to do is devise a graphical procedure for doing identification in these hierarchical causal models. Okay. So here's my confounder graph. I turned it into a structural equation and a causal graph, and I got these Q variables and so on. Here's my estimand, the expected performance in the world where I intervene and I set everybody's tutoring hours to be drawn from Q star A. So I'm going to write that down in this way, expectation of mu of Q of y in the world where I intervene on QA. Now, let me explain this notation. Mu of Q of y is equal to the expectation under Q of y, a marginal distribution over test performance of y, and Q of y is the marginal distribution of test performance inside the subunit. All right, so Q of y just equals this integral QA of A, QY given A, dA, right? That's just probability. And, but to be clear, this is the marginal distribution of test performance within a school, right? That's why it's capitalized here, it's random. Okay, so this is an expectation across schools, and this is a random marginal distribution of test performance in a school. In other words, I don't know, I'm going to pluck a school from my collection of schools, and it's got some distribution of tutoring hours, and it's got some relationship between y and tutoring hours, and what I'm looking at is the marginal distribution of test performance in that world. Okay, that's just this. Make sense? Okay, and so this expectation of y, this is like a little iterated expectation. It's a little complicated way to write it, but that's all that is really. What I want you to notice is that this estimand is only a function of Q variables. Q of y is this marginalization, and I'm intervening on QA. Okay, so this is just something about Q variables. So in classical identification analysis, we take n to infinity. We imagine the number of units goes to infinity. For hierarchical causal models, we're going to take both n and m to infinity. So we're going to ask, can I identify the causal effect if I had an infinite number of schools and each school had an infinite number of students? And what that means is that these Q variables are effectively observed, right? If I had an infinite number of students in each school, then I don't need to worry about about variation of students within the school because I've seen an infinite number of students. I can tell you exactly what the different Q factors are going to be. So we call this graphical approach to identification collapse and augment, all right? And what's going to happen is we're going to do this thing. It's going to result in a flat causal graphical model, a classical one, that's going to be equivalent to the HCM in both pre- and post-intervention distributions, and then we do identification in that model. Okay, so first what we're going to do is we're going to what we call collapse the model. We write the model down in terms of these Q variables. So there's my confounder. And I remove the subunit variables because I'm imagining an infinite number of students in the schools. All right, and so you can see now already what happened. I made my Q variables, excuse me, and they are effectively observed because I saw an infinite number of students. But remember, I did not preserve that connectivity between them, right? That went away. And so that's going to help us, okay? But the second step, this is in terms of QA and QY given A. But our causal estimand is in terms of QY, which was this integral. And so I'm going to add QY, which is a deterministic function. I'm using double arrows to denote that, of QA and QY given A. All right, so that's collapse and augment. All right, so now this is my graphical model that I want to try to identify the causal effect of intervening on QA on QY. All right, and so, again, here's my causal estimand. And this, if you know graphical models, you can see is easy to identify with backdoor adjustment. QY given A is, I need to condition on that and marginalize it out, and then I can get the distribution of QY in the world where I intervene on QA. Okay? It's P of QY given A, P of QY given Q star A and QY given A, DQY given A. All right? This is an interventional distribution. This is all about the observational distribution. Okay? One nuance here is that P of QY given Q star A and QY given A is essentially a delta mass at the right QY given A that when combined with QA gives me QY. All right, it's a little funky, but it works out. Okay. All right, at a higher level, the point is this. I took that hierarchical model, I turned it into this flat causal model. This flat causal model allows for identification of the effect of QA on QY. That's it. We took that identification formula, we ran a little simulation just to demonstrate that it works, and you can see as we see more and more data in terms of number of units and subunits, we get closer and closer to the true effect, whereas a naive regression is going to be biased. The theory already tells you that this is true, but this is just a demonstration. So we're going to now play that game with the interference graph. So when we collapse the interference graph, the Q variables are going to attach to the mediator. There is the collapse graph for the interference graph. Again, I got my Q variables for the different factors in the subunit, but they attach to the mediators, right? And again, the intuition, if more students receive tutoring, QA, then there's going to be more classroom discussion, Z. And that classroom discussion is going to change the conditional distribution of scores, how much tutoring affects my score. We're going to augment it. We add QY. And now these Q variables, all right, so we're going to augment it QY, and this is the graph. Good. Now, again, we have the same causal estimand. The effect on QY of intervening on QA. Now it's going to get a little hairier. We write that down in terms of, again, a point mass at the marginal, now times the change in QY given A by that intervention. And this, the change in QY given A based on the intervention on QA, can be found with what's called front door adjustment. I won't go into the details here. If you're familiar with it, that's great. You just saw an application of front door adjustment. If not, you can read about it in Pearl's work. It's another way to get at the intervention distribution using terms from the observation distribution. That's all that's important. And that we can do it here, whereas we couldn't do it if we had already aggregated the data. Again, a simple simulation to show you that it's doing the right thing. The instrument graph, this is the last one, is, again, the estimand is expectation of y due A, but now y, remember, is at the unit level. This is like, is the school in a published list of top schools? Here again, we collapse and augment the graph. It's a little special in that the augmentation is on the treatment variable, right? Because QA is a function of QZ and QA given Z. And QA given Z and QZ only affect Y through QA, okay? Identification now comes from backdoor adjustment. And what this shows you is that in this graph, you can do identification without the usual kinds of assumptions that instrumental variable analysis requires, right? The details are in the paper about that. Okay, and again, here's a simple simulation just to confirm. So what we're doing, by the way, in these simple simulations is taking the identification formula, in this case it comes from backdoor adjustment, and just doing the dumbest Monte Carlo estimates of each term, and then estimating the distribution or expectation through that. Okay, that's the slog of the details of this idea. The main point is you might be in a causal inference situation where you have subunits inside units. If you are, you can reason about that by thinking about random distributions of subunits inside units. And those random distributions won't necessarily be connected in the same way as the subunits were. And that could open the door to causal inference where it was otherwise unavailable from aggregated data. That's the punchline. So, as a sort of real-world study, I say sort of because this is like the digits of hierarchical Bayesian analysis. We looked at the old data from the 8 schools, all right? And actually, this data is about, it's a coincidence, test performance and tutoring hours. And this data has become a staple of hierarchical Bayesian modeling. And the idea behind this data is to estimate the effect of test preparation on the SAT verbal, which is a standardized test. I say it's a coincidence because we use that example just to work out these ideas. And then at the end, we thought, oh, let's look at 8 schools. And then it turns out 8 schools is about that example. Okay. So here's our variables. Xij is the previous test score for student J. Aij is tutoring hours. Yij is SAT performance. And one thing you can do is imagine there are no causal issues, that this is just, everything is fine. Okay? And now you just look at a big average. Okay? And that's not even hierarchical Bayes. That's just taking the raw data and calculating a big conditional average of y given a and x. Now, you could imagine in the 8 schools example that there could be unit level, by the way, 8 schools means n equals 8. Okay, you can imagine in 8 schools there could be unit level confounders that affect both treatment and outcome. All right, and Eli looked at the original 1979 paper, found this quote, where student interest far exceeded the program's capacity, a larger number of students went into the control group than in the treatment group. Okay, what that means is that there are some hidden variables here that are affecting distributions of tutoring hours and, of course, performance because there is student interest, right? You can imagine in schools where people are interested in tutoring, they probably are doing better on the test. I mean, I'm not an expert, but you can imagine that. What's interesting, I thought, just historically, is that when you run through our methodology with this graph, you get back classical hierarchical Bayesian modeling, right? Which means that doing the classical hierarchical Bayesian modeling thing, even though it's not a causal thing, gives you the same algorithm as imagining a causal graph with this unobserved confounder. I thought that was kind of interesting. Now, could there be interference? Turns out that class size, the class size of the tutoring hours, of the tutoring class, depends on school size, as well as, of course, treatment, and affects the score Yij. Right? So this is another case of interference. And so we reanalyzed the 8 schools data using this hierarchical causal graph. And what we found is that if you imagine, and there's, again, a quote, I don't have it in here from the paper, saying that class size could really be a thing. You find that whereas the paper found a small positive effect to tutoring, the uncertainty about it when you think about the possibility of interference, goes up, and you can't conclude that there is any good effect for tutoring on SAT performance. Again, I'm not suggesting that this is any kind of new result in educational data analysis, rather that a way to use hierarchical causal models in a real-world setting. Okay, so in summary, nested data and hierarchical models are a mainstay of Bayesian statistics, but today I told you about how to think about nested data in the context of causal models. The key idea: the nested data produces a flat model of distributions that if you see many, many, many students, you've effectively observed, and now you can reason about those distributions. But it doesn't inherit the connectivity of the original model, which can open the door to identification and estimation. There's lots of things you can imagine doing. Different applications. I mentioned the T-cell application that we're finishing up now. You could think about using this in the context of multi-site experiments. You can think about all different kinds of places where you have many related groups of data, a causal inference question that you have about all of them, and where this could help you deal with some of the unobserved variables that are lurking in those data sets. As I mentioned, we did the most naive, silly little estimation algorithms using Monte Carlo, but I enjoy doing Bayesian inference, and so you could imagine, and this has random distributions in it, and so one thought would be to think about Bayesian nonparametrics, which is all about how to do Bayesian analysis on random distributions in the context of these hierarchical causal models or other better estimation algorithms. And then another question is this method complete? In other words, can it always find, can the algorithm for deciding whether or not it's identifiable always find out that it is identifiable if it is? This is a theoretical question that we have not answered. If you're interested, there's a paper on the archive. That's it. These are the extra slides. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Dave.
Tiring.
Wonderfully explained talk. Okay, so questions. I'll try to run around, and also if you can come to the mic as well.
I was wondering about measurement noise in the observed parameters. At one point you said all the noise we observed is the result of hidden causes, but
Yeah.
it could just be random sampling and measurement errors, which is, I think, a lot the case in some of the data sets we look at. And
Yeah.
it seems like, especially if there are differences, and the causal effects could appear smaller for variables that have more measurement noise and that sort of thing. And is it still possible to identify the causal
Right.
effects in those cases?
So I think the answer to your question is that I told you earlier I'm a little allergic to the philosophical stuff, but I think the answer is that the subunit level noise is measurement noise, right? So that could be seen as a hidden cause. The hidden cause is some crazy stuff that a genius could figure out was there, is creating noise in my subunit variable. Or maybe it's innate randomness, I'm not sure. That's why I said it's kind of philosophical. So that's where measurement noise would live. Now, can you still identify? I made a big assumption here, which is that you have an infinite number of subunit variables. A question here, I should add it to this list, what are the finite sample properties of these estimators, right? This is an important question.
It seems to me the measurement noise does not affect the other variables. It's just what you observe.
Again, yeah, that's right. So that's why it would be in like the, let me get my guy.
Yeah.
That's why it would be like, if there's an epsilon here in the structural equation model, right? The randomness in Aij is because of measurement noise, for example. That's the idea. That's where measurement noise would be modeled in this situation. And indeed, thought of as unconfounded. It doesn't connect to anything else. It just connects to Aij. But of course, if you see an infinite number of these subunits, then all that measurement noise is washed out, except that you, of course, don't. So that's why it's an interesting question to ask. One, what are the finite sample properties? But two, even theoretically, how do I think about more subunits, like we were talking about at lunch, more subunits versus more units? Yeah, good question. Yeah.
Hey, so I have a question about the error bars and uncertainty. So towards the end, you mentioned this. So one question, I guess, is how do you compute these? Are these uncertainties over the identified model or the randomness for an experiment, or both? And why was it that in your model you had error bars that weren't overlapping with the truth for small samples? Should we expect those error bars to overlap with the truth but just be really big when you have small samples? Is there a bias?
Yep. So I need to check the paper, but my memory is we did simple like bootstrapping to get error bars here. So this is like estimation error bars. And the reason that you see and again, these identifiability results are for infinite numbers of subunits and units. So when you're in a finite sample situation where there's 10 students in a school and 15 schools, there's going to be bias. And so understanding this, of course, is a good open question.
Do you think there are ways to have a bigger error bar on the left? For your
Have
blue?
a bigger one?
Yeah, I mean it's too small, right?
Oh, this.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. Yeah.
There's sort of two kind of data settings I'm sort of thinking about that I think maybe are related but not exactly the same as your school example. And they're basically the same. One is time, one is space. So you can imagine sort of time series data where the hierarchy is maybe not so well defined, such as which school, but maybe I want to say, do I time average over a year or over a minute? And many minutes map to an hour, many hours map to a day, and so on. And then same thing, maybe more close to what people work on here, like spatial data. I maybe have some sort of confounding on the scale of tissues, which is maybe like centimeters, and then individual cells and so on. And I was wondering if you could speak to, I guess, this question of searching for the correct hierarchical level upon which to separate your data.
That's a good question. Yeah, so let's just get a graph up. Right, so you're highlighting a assumption I've been making this whole time, right? Which is some kind of exchangeability assumption. The schools, they're all exchangeable with each other. And the joint distribution of the school level data doesn't change if I put the schools in a different order in that joint distribution. Now spatially, right, we could add a node here, which is the lat long of the school, and that affects everything. And then essentially you've got conditional on that, it's exchangeable, and so everybody's happy, right? You've found enough variables to make it conditionally exchangeable, to make it exchangeable. So one question is, what if you can't find variables to make it exchangeable, or what if they are organized in a time series where there's something latent that is drifting, and we haven't thought about that. Theoretically, I think these ideas could be extended to that situation, but I wouldn't know quite how to do it in front of all of you. But certainly the case where you can find variables that you can condition on to make it exchangeable, and that variable could be time-stamped too, right? Space and time is all the same. So you could do it that way. Your second question is about what level to hierarchicalize.
Yeah, I'm kind of like thinking like, centimeters map to millimeters map to micrometers.
Right, I see. So like in other words, if I have groups within groups within groups at finer and finer scales, or do you mean even just what scale to think about the data at?
It seems like your model is sort of mapping out exchangeability with respect to different types of confounding. So there seems to be, maybe you're concerned about confounding relative to tissue type. You would want to sort of group things at the level at which tissue type kind of doesn't vary, kind of with the schools. Whereas then if I was worried about removing a signal with respect to, I don't know, some other, that happens at some other length scale, I could pick the...
I see what you mean. Like, I don't quite know how to answer the question, but you're saying that somehow the definition of the subunit is relative to the definition of the confounder in a sense.
Yeah, so maybe with schools, I could have broken it up by classrooms.
Right. Yep.
Okay, so which one do I do?
Right. Yep. Yeah, my hunch is that there's something to say about that, and that you could do it. Yeah.
Okay.
No, that's my hunch. Yeah, I agree with you. It's very interesting. It's related to the idea of like at what level do I want to model things, and you're right. It relates to exchangeability, but here it relates to where can I model things such that when I know the distribution of that, I'm able to unhinge identification. Right? It's good. Yeah.
I think my question is related to the last one actually, because I guess when you have this hierarchy of hierarchies or something, like in principle you can have other levels of confounding, and you could add on to this, like have a deeper hierarchical causal graphical model,
Absolutely,
I suppose, right?
yes.
So in principle, I guess you could do that, but that's, I guess, where the finite sample stuff becomes relevant, because you only have so much data, right? And then the more you add these levels, I'm trying to understand when does it start hurting in some sense to do that.
I mean, I think that also that has to do with, in the previous question, about where the confounding is kicking in. So, if these schools were all in different countries, for example, there might be, and there might be subgroups within the groups, and those subgroups might might involve confounding at that subgroup level. And so you might want to model it at that point too. Or it might be that going deeper down, maybe this is countries and these are school averages, there is no confounding, and so there's no point in doing it. But you're right, that would also be interesting from a finite sample perspective. Like if there's no confounding, I imagine aggregating the data and modeling it is better, right? And so maybe making that precise would be interesting. Yeah.
One question, and then we can take other questions after.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay,
this will be
let's-
quick because I essentially was asking, I was curious about the same thing as him, but I was just curious, presumably this process generalizes to several levels of hierarchy, but
Yes.
I was curious if you know anything about the trade-off between like increasing the levels of hierarchy in terms of how much it helps you like be able to make better causal reasoning versus how much it requires you to have like more data at each level.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you're right, that relates to the answer to the previous question. Probably if there's no confounding or issues, if there are no causal issues below this level, probably it hurts to break everything up. And so maybe you want to aggregate at the highest level possible such that there is no confounding issues or no identification issues would be a more general way of saying it. These are good points you're all making.
I know there are more questions, but maybe so that others can leave, since we're already over time, we'll just have them come up to you directly.
Yeah.
So
Great.
thank you so much.
Thanks, Caroline. Thank you.